message to the students inside the encampment is go back to class and stop the nonsense.
My tuition allows me to get on this grass.
Campus protests spread across the nation with hundreds of arrests made, and Texas Governor Greg Abbott cracks down in that state. There's no end in sight, with schools shutting down and protesters vowing to continue. Plus, Trump's lawyers are back in court today, this time arguing in front of the Supreme Court, hoping to convince the justices that the former president has complete immunity from his time in office. Also breaking today, Harvey Weinstein has had his 2020 rape conviction overturned in New York. We have a lot to get to, so helping us break it down is a constitutional law expert, criminal defense and civil rights lawyer, Robert McWhirter. Robert, thank you so much for being here today. First off, Trump's lawyers are hoping to convince the Supreme Court that he holds presidential immunity. Depending on the outcome, how far-reaching could their decision be?
Oh, that could be monumentally far-reaching, and far-reaching for the future. It defines, in a sense, what the Constitution means forevermore. And it would actually be unprecedented. There's very little. There's the Nixon case, but there's very little as far as direction. You know, a point should be made, and that is that Trump's lawyers, in a sense, have already won what they wanted, which is to delay Jack Smith's investigation. And everything's on hold while the Supreme Court does that. If you'd like a little historical analysis, I think his arguments in the court are fundamentally weak. If you remember, you know, America started with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and the Declaration said, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal. Well, after that, it indicts King George for all of the things that caused him not to be our sovereign anymore, one of which was he has incited domestic insurrections among us. So that was a criminal charge, and the founders of our Constitution did not mean to create a new office like a king. And that's a perfect example of why Mr. Trump should not receive this kind of immunity.
So it's interesting that you bring that point up, because there's one clip that I think is getting quite a bit of traction on social media and just, you know, around town here in Washington. I want you to take a listen to what Justice Sonia Sotomayor asked during the arguments this morning.
If the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him, is that within his official acts that for which he can get immunity?
It would depend on the hypothetical, but we can see that could well be an official act.
It could, and why? Because he's doing it for personal reasons.
So, Robert, this is an extremely bold argument for Trump's team, no?
Oh, it is incredibly bold. Look, let's say President Biden says, hey, you know, keeping all those documents down in Mar-a-Lago shows you're a security risk to the United States of America, which, by the way, is one of the cases against Donald Trump right now. And he orders SEAL Team 6 to take Donald Trump out. Donald Trump's own argument says that is it, and it's an official act, and Joe Biden cannot be prosecuted. And I will note it's kind of interesting because on the campaign trail, Mr. Trump keeps saying, well, we should criminally prosecute Joe Biden for the cases he has against me and the weaponization of the justice system, et cetera. But now he's contradicting that very argument in the Supreme Court, where he says, no, anything a president does during his time as president gets absolute immunity. And he has this, I think, spurious argument that the president would have no power. Look, no presidents have thought they had this absolute immunity, and our presidents are plenty powerful and have been for decades, at least for the majority of the 20th and this part of the 21st century. I don't think that argument holds much weight. And it's a pretty horrifying America where a president can decide to just kill you and doesn't have any ramifications personally for it.
Right, right. And, you know, I want to go back to a point you touched on earlier, but maybe dive deeper into it. As you said, this is an unprecedented case, but are there any past legal rulings for justices to lean on? I know you mentioned former President Nixon, but is there anything that comes close to this?
Well, the thing is, President Nixon's cases didn't, on this level, got quite that far. The big issues there were the tapes that he had in his office, and they were ruled. Basically, there's a lot of wording in those opinions that say, look, this is not absolute powers. that presidents have. Something to think about our Constitution is it actually gives very few powers actually directly to the president. Most presidential powers come from acts of Congress. So when Richard Nixon, he made a statement in his interview with Robert Frost, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. That was widely condemned and a really bad moment for former President Richard Nixon as just being totally out of touch with what the vision is of America and what we mean by everybody's equal under the law.
So I want to switch gears to another case involving the former President Trump. Testimony continued today in his hush money trial. What's the latest coming out of the courtroom?
Well, I must say I found, and I've paid attention to the opening statements quite closely. What the prosecution did is something I think was tactically very smart. They broadened this case. This is not just a case about Stormy Daniels and whether hush money payments were made. They broadened this through the testimony of Mr. Pecker of the National Enquirer to a much broader case involving presidential influence and undue influence in receiving campaign benefits and contributions unreported in order to benefit his bid to become the president of the United States. That means that what happened with Ms. Daniels, or Ms. Clifford is her real name, was only one small part of a much greater problem, as is the McDougal situation and et cetera. All of this was part of a concerted effort to subvert campaign finance laws. And we have those laws to protect the voters and to protect the integrity of the system. And I thought what the prosecution did there was very smart. So even if they go in and kind of, attack Ms. Clifford during her testimony or Mr. Cohen during his testimony, it's a much broader case. And it looks like the prosecutor has the goods to show it, as with Mr. Pecker's testimony very clearly showed.
Right. And to put more on the former president's plate, the former president was just listed as a co-conspirator in Arizona after the state charged Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows, and 16 co-defendants with felony counts of over a scheme to subvert the 2020 election by filing false electoral votes. What exactly are those charges?
Well, now this is my home state. And what the charges are is basically violation of the electoral laws in the state. Look, this is... First of all, very few of us and very few of your voters have actually voted for the president of the United States. We don't vote for the president. We vote for electors. And those electors are presented by the parties. So if you notice on your presidential ballot, you check off either the Republican or the Democrat or the whatever. But then there's a slate there and they're listed. And most people don't know what those people do. Well, those are our electors. And the electors go, and there's a certificate of the vote. There's a certificate of ascertainment, and then there's a certificate of the vote. What these Republicans did was they replaced the proper certificate of the vote with a fake certificate of the vote, arguing that, well, the original certificate of ascertainment, and I'm sorry about the technical language here, but the certificate of ascertainment that said Joe Biden won the election in Arizona, we're not even going to count that. We're going to give it a whole different certificate of vote and send that into Congress. Now, at the same time, part of this bigger conspiracy is Congress and people in Congress were supposed to then accept the fake certificate of vote with the different set of electors and put those in to show that Donald Trump won Arizona, despite the fact that the popular vote and the electoral votes went for President Biden. So it was just kind of this little switch out the forms, and they were under the theory was, well, obviously Joe Biden couldn't have won because there was widespread electoral fraud, of which there is absolutely no evidence. I got to tell you, this kind of shows what people with no sense of democracy or respect for democracy, and maybe who just need a little bit better morals, can do, just trying to slip in something contrary to the will of the voters. I mean, democracy doesn't mean you get a win all the time. That's why we compromise and make a better country. That's why we all buy off on the American dream about being able to govern ourselves. Because look, even though the guy I voted for didn't win or the gal I voted for didn't win, it's still America, and we support those people to work on our behalf.
You know, there's been a lot of legal news, involving former President Trump today, but there was another piece of legal news today that was really, I think a shock to so many people watching this case. A New York appeals court just reversed Harvey Weinstein's rape conviction, dealing a major blow to victims. Robert, do you think there's a chance he could be released until prosecutors decide to retry his case?
Well, if it was just a case in New York, there would be a chance. But don't forget, he has a conviction in California, too.
Yeah.
So it's just a change of prison location. I mean, maybe Mr. Weinstein might like the view from a different cell, but he's just going to go to a different cell. Look, there was a technical issue here. There's a federal rule. There's a rule of evidence. It's called 404B, which tells you that you can show other acts to show a common motive, scheme, or plan. But then there's a long tradition of evidence rules that say, look, you can't just convict somebody because, okay, here's evidence that he convicted 20 other burglaries and therefore he should be convicted of this burglary. You got to show evidence of this individual crime. And the court said, well, they did too much of the other act evidence with all these other women coming in, and therefore we're going to overturn that conviction. Look, I make my living as a criminal defense lawyer, and I can understand that. But I must say this is actually very sad and kind of a lack of vindication for the women with great courage who had to come and show themselves to testify in his case. So that was unfortunate. He could be retried again, and they would have to go through all that again. But, he's sitting there in California. They may at this point just decide, well, let's just set it set and see how he does in California.
Yeah, a lot of backlash to that decision in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I want to switch gears. Another Supreme Court case is happening. Justices heard arguments related to Idaho's strict abortion ban. Is there any sign on how the justices are leaning on this 2 years after Roe versus Wade was overturned?
Well, now that's interesting. And I think it's interesting for a very key reason. The women justices are really asserting themselves very strongly and kind of calling out what's really the absurd position of the state of Idaho, saying that women cannot receive any kind of this care, even to preserve, let's say, her organs so she could have children in the future, or if there's risk that's going to happen if she's not treated. Sometimes pregnancies have to be terminated in order to save a mother, and sometimes that needs to be done to save her health later on, her ability to reproduce in the future. And the women justices are very active. And I think that's symbolic because, when these statutes passed, no woman could vote. No woman was in the legislature. I, of course, am in Arizona, and we just had the 1864 statute upheld by the Arizona Supreme Court. No woman had a voice in that. And in fact, for that matter, almost no person of color did either. So you're taking a statute from 1864 of which maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of the society had a vote in, and saying that should be the norm and value for today. And I think that women today certainly have something to say about that, as do the women justices on the United States Supreme Court right now during those arguments. They're not being particularly kind to a lawyer from Idaho who's arguing that position.
Right. Well, certainly a major issue to watch going forward, particularly in an election year. Robert McWhirter, thank you so much for breaking down really a really long list of legal issues today. We appreciate it.
My great pleasure.
As pro-Palestinian protesters take over college campuses nationwide, lawmakers are starting to hit the front line in support of students. Plus, conservatives aren't backing down, vowing to stop any additional funding to Ukraine in the future. How will their fight play out in the House and the Senate? Joining me now is my colleague, The Hill's Brett Samuels. Brett, thank you so much for being here. I want to start off with those campus protests. They're spreading across the nation. Speaker Johnson and GOP lawmakers spoke at Columbia University yesterday. How are student protesters reacting to the response we've seen from lawmakers?
Yeah, Julia, Speaker Johnson and some of the other Republicans who joined him at Columbia received, I think it's fair to say, a chilly reception from the students on campus there. Speaker Johnson was delivering remarks there, but he was sort of repeatedly heckled and booed as he tried to speak and as other lawmakers tried to speak. So this visit from Speaker Johnson, where he met with the university president and was there to essentially say, that these protests needed to end, essentially, that he was condemning any shred of anti-Semitism in these protests. That message was, it was not received warmly, I think. And maybe that's because of the politics of a Republican speaker coming to New York City to an Ivy League campus. But certainly, Washington lawmakers have taken notice of these protests. They are not showing any reservations about weighing in on them, even as some of the students on campus have some reservations about lawmakers getting involved.
Absolutely, and worth noting that Democratic lawmakers have also visited Columbia University in response to the protests. Now, former President Trump has responded to the nationwide protests on Truth Social. What's he saying?
Yeah, former President Trump, he's weighed in really for a few days now on these protests, trying to paint them as sort of a result of President Biden's rhetoric on the situation in Gaza and the war between Israel and Hamas, saying that these protests are Biden's fault. Most recently, he compared these protests on campuses to the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville from 2017, where a counter-protester was killed when a car drove into a crowd there. And Trump essentially said that Charlottesville protest was, quote, peanuts compared to these Israel protests. So, Trump is trying to essentially minimize some of the protests that happened during his own administration and really kind of play up the divisions that these protests are underlining on college campuses, and trying to argue that, these protests are a result of Biden's policies, and really try to pin them on the White House and President Biden during a campaign season here.
Governors are also weighing in. Notably, Texas Governor Greg Abbott is under fire after arrests were made in Austin, and a Fox News reporter was arrested and charged with criminal trespassing. Are we seeing tensions rise even higher here at these protests across the country?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say that tensions are on the rise. Just in the last few days, we've seen these protests really spread to other college campuses, like you mentioned, obviously in Texas. We're seeing them at Emory University in Georgia, at University of Southern California. So this is becoming sort of a nationwide trend where it's no longer just a handful of Ivy League universities at Columbia or Yale, but really sort of a nationwide issue. And as you mentioned, Governor Abbott in Texas is sort of an example where some governors are looking to potentially crack down on these protests and send in law enforcement. And as we've seen in the past, that could have the potential to really only escalate tensions and make things worse. So this definitely bears watching how folks like Governor Abbott in Texas, whether they continue to escalate, whether they continue to get law enforcement involved, or in some cases, maybe governors call for the National Guard, or whether tensions simmer in the coming days. But certainly these protests show no signs of slowing down.
Yeah, earlier today, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said if there were any protesters on Florida campuses that got out of hand, those protesters would be expelled. So interesting remarks there. I want to switch gears here. Aid for Ukraine has started to make its way to the front line, but conservatives are railing against the move and vowing to stop any additional aid from making its way overseas. Brett, do you think this will lead to another showdown once again over this issue in the House and the Senate?
Yeah, it's interesting because before this legislation was passed just a few days ago to provide more aid to Ukraine, we heard the same thing from conservatives, particularly in the House, saying, no more aid for Ukraine, that's a red line for them. If the conservative Speaker Johnson, passed aid for Ukraine, that would be a problem for them. And yet, it made it through both chambers with a bipartisan vote. So clearly there's bipartisan support for Ukraine, for aid to Ukraine. But that being said, just given the politics of a campaign season, given sort of the divisions within the Republican Party over this, and Republicans obviously controlling the House, it is going to make it really difficult to pass more Ukraine aid. And certainly I'd be surprised if we saw another push for Ukraine aid before the election in November. And the big question then is what happens in November in terms of the White House, in terms of control of the Congress, and what does that mean for Ukraine aid moving forward? So certainly this was a big victory for the White House and for some lawmakers on Capitol Hill that they passed this aid. But it's sort of to be determined whether we'll see sort of a similar bipartisan push in the future, or as you mentioned, if conservative Republicans will basically make this the last tranche of aid.
Yep. We'll be watching that story as it develops. I want to move to the campaign trail. New Decision Desk numbers have Biden and Trump tied in a three-way race with RFK Jr. This seems to be a good sign for Democrats. Brett, has there been any reaction from the White House? I know that Democrats have been preparing for RFK Jr. and the DNC even has, resources allocated to combat third-party candidates right now.
Yeah, exactly. And to that point, this is definitely welcome news for the White House and welcome news for the Biden campaign. who, for months, really, Biden campaign officials had told me that they felt like Biden's poll numbers would bounce back once voters started to pay more attention, once they started to realize that the choice was essentially going to be President Biden or former President Trump again in November. And this is evidence, I think, to your point, Democrats and the Biden campaign and allies of the White House have really been trying to push this message that RFK Jr. could essentially, win the election for Trump, that he could tip the scales in Trump's favor by just taking away just a sliver of votes from Biden. So this is, potentially the result of a really concerted effort by Democrats affiliated with the Biden campaign to get that message out, to point out that, a lot of RFK Jr.'s donors are actually Republicans who are Trump supporters, to point out some of his policies that people might not be familiar with. So like you said, this is definitely good news for the White House, good news for the Biden campaign. And obviously there's still, close to 6 months until Election Day. And I would expect we'll continue to hear sort of this drumbeat of warnings from the White House and from the Biden campaign about the risks of voting for RFK Jr.
And speaking of President Biden, he's making his way to Syracuse, New York today to tout a $6 billion deal with semiconductor manufacturer Micron. Is this a big win for American tech companies?
Yeah, shout out to Syracuse, home of my alma mater. But yeah, this is definitely sort of the latest in a string of announcements that the Biden administration has made as far as funding from the Chips and Science Act, which was this big bipartisan legislation signed in 2022 that's designed to invest in semiconductor manufacturing, which are chips used for phones, cars, everyday technology and appliances. We've seen these announcements for Micron, which is what President Biden is touting in Syracuse, for Intel, which President Biden touted in Arizona, as well as some other companies, Global Foundries, another upstate New York company. So this is definitely something that we've seen the White House has really made a concerted effort to elevate this, to tout how these billions of dollars are going back into American companies that will produce thousands of jobs for Americans here domestically. And it's something that we've seen even Republicans have gotten behind. When there was a deal announced for Samsung in Texas, Senator Cornyn, a Republican, put out a statement celebrating that funding. So this is something that the White House is really proud of. They really think it's going to have huge benefits for the economy. The question is whether that resonates for voters, whether they're paying enough attention to see sort of these companies reaping these benefits.
I know this is something that Biden and his campaign have talked about quite a bit, so we'll see how it plays with voters. Brett Samuels, thank you so much, and go Orange.
Thanks, Julia. Go Orange.
TikTok CEO vows to fight a U.S. ban signed by President Biden this week. The bill will force TikTok's parent company ByteDance to sell the social media app to a U.S.-based company or face a national ban. Critics were quick to argue it violates TikTok users' First Amendment rights, but for years, lawmakers have voiced concerns that the social media app is heavily influenced by Chinese authorities and user data could end up in the wrong hands. There's also concern that TikTok could be used to suppress certain content. It will end up being a long, drawn-out court case, but if upheld, could set a legal precedent with wide-ranging complications for digital media companies. New numbers from the Commerce Department show an economic slowdown over the last 3 months. The report Thursday showed the GDP expanded at 1.6% in the first quarter of 2024, a significant pullback from the 3.4% growth in the previous quarter, and nearly a whole percentage point lower than what economists predicted. The report suggests that lower than expected growth could be due to a slowdown in spending on goods like cars and gas. It also suggests inflation may be more resilient than expected, holding firm at 3.7% over the last 3 months. Senator Bernie Sanders is pushing back against the cost of diabetes drugs. The Vermont senator has launched an investigation into what he says are outrageously high prices of Novo Nordisk diabetes and weight loss drugs Ozempic and Wegovy. Sanders penned a letter Wednesday to the company's CEO notifying them of the investigation and calling attention to his concerns. Sanders cited a Yale University report that he said found the drugs could be profitably manufactured for less than $5 a month, but those same drugs cost hundreds per month currently. And Kim Kardashian is coming to Washington. Axios reported that the reality TV star will take part in a roundtable discussion on criminal justice reform with Vice President Kamala Harris at the White House today. Now, this isn't Kardashian's first time at the White House. She worked with former President Trump on criminal justice reform during his administration. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.